Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we tear through the source material so you don't have to get lost in the footnotes. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into the War of 1812, a conflict that, well, historians often treat as a kind of messy footnote between the American Revolution and the Civil War.
Right, sort of stuck in the middle there.
Exactly. But when you view it through the lens of naval strategy and policy, it becomes this profound lesson in national consequence. Our sources today are detailed historical analyses, really pulling back the curtain on the political and military relationship between Great Britain and the United States, focusing on preparation or maybe the staggering lack thereof.
And this is just such a critical study, I think, for anyone interested in how, national identity butts up against geopolitical reality. This wasn't just some brief skirmish. It was really a devastating collision.
Yeah.
On one side, you have Britain's deep-seated, almost ancestral maritime convictions, rooted in 150 years of naval supremacy.
Right.
And on the other, the uncertain new identity of the United States, which tried really to use economic leverage where it just possessed no military strength.
A fundamental mismatch.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the lessons here about preparation are, well, they're painful, but inescapable.
So our mission today is to unpack the three main forces that really determine the outcome of this thing. First, we absolutely have to understand the unwavering, almost stubborn nature of that ancestral British maritime law and how its commitment to defense just trumped everything else.
Everything.
Second, we'll analyze the, frankly, spectacular failure of the American strategy to use commercial policy as a weapon, like economic warfare.
A big gamble that didn't pay off.
Not at all. And finally, we'll examine the shocking contrast in the resulting military conflict. The utter failure and, let's be honest, incompetence on land.
Oh, it's rough.
Set against the surprising, almost world-changing brilliance shown by just a handful of naval commanders. We're going to detail everything, from General Hull's, well, embarrassing surrender, right up to Captain McDonough's pivotal, war-saving victory on Lake Champlain.
It's quite a story arc.
Okay, so to really get the war, you have to start with that fundamental British conviction. We often think the conflict was driven by, trade or profit.
The usual suspects.
Right. But our sources show the real engine of British policy was something far more essential, prioritizing national security, what they called navigation, way above immediate commercial gain. How deep did this commitment actually run?
Oh, it ran right into the core identity of the nation.
Yeah.
Seriously. We're talking about convictions built up over 150 years of just uniform success, primarily codified in those navigation acts you mentioned.
Yeah.
The British firmly believed, this is a key quote, that existence takes precedence of prosperity.
Wow, that's stark.
It is. They saw command of the sea not just as a source of wealth, but as the only guarantor of national survival against the continent, against threats like Napoleon.
And this wasn't just like a convenient commercial philosophy they cooked up. It was a strategic imperative that even their biggest economic critics had to admit was necessary.
Exactly. Even Adam Smith, right, the great champion of free trade, challenging mercantilism.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect him to agree.
But he did. In Wealth of Nations, he specifically conceded this point. He agreed that the defense of the realm justified trade regulation, precisely because navigation policy was necessary to serve as the nursery for the Navy.
A nursery for the Navy. Explain that a bit.
Well, you needed a vast, skilled merchant marine population, right? Thousands of sailors. Because those were the guys who would crew the warships you needed for defense in wartime.
Ah, got it. So you regulate trade even if it means a monopoly.
Even if it hurt pure economic opulence, as Smith put it, because national defense was superior. You had to have the sailors.
So this mindset was just completely entrenched. Was it just a British thing, or was this like the global standard back then?
Oh, the historical material makes it clear this was universally accepted global statecraft, not uniquely British at all.
Really?
Yeah. Montesquieu, writing decades earlier, basically summarized the conventional wisdom. He said, commercial monopoly is the leading principle of colonial intercourse. That's just how empires worked. And you even see evidence across the channel. The French National Convention, right? In 1794, height of the Revolution.
You'd expect them to reject old imperial ideas.
You would. But they issued a decree that was practically identical in spirit and purpose to the English Navigation Act of 1651. Everyone understood Control colonial trade, foster naval power. That was the game.
Okay, this context makes American independence immediately a huge problem for London then. Once the U.S. was free, it basically revived, as the sources put it, the once dreaded rivalry of the Dutch as independent carriers.
Instantly. The U.S. became an economic threat, sure, but more dangerously, a maritime threat.
How so?
Well, look at the Revolutionary War. When American trade was suspended, what happened? British ships immediately filled the gap. It proved to Britain their system worked. But after 1783, they saw this new, kind of frightening development.
Which was?
This Western Atlantic maritime system the colonists had built. Small, fast ships, a large, hardy maritime population. And crucially, these sailors were, quote, out of easy reach of impressment. They were far away from Europe's constant wars.
So Britain feared this separate, growing sea power right across the ocean.
Deeply. They saw it threatening that nursery for their own navy.
Okay, that fear of losing their naval nursery takes us directly to the flashpoint, impressment, the really sensitive issue for Americans. The British claiming the right to board American ships and take sailors they said were British subjects.
Yeah, this practice became the grievous wrong that just fueled American outrage. And the problem was really twofold. First, the legal claim itself.
What was their argument?
The British argued that any British-born sailor, when recalled by a royal proclamation during wartime, was legally a deserter if found on a foreign ship. And they claimed the right to seize him anywhere.
Okay, and the second problem?
The practical side, implementation. As Lord Grenville admitted way back in 1797, telling Native Americans apart from British subjects was almost impossible. Quote, owing to similarity of language, habits, and manners.
So they just grabbed people.
Often, yes, which resulted in the forced perpetual servitude of thousands of actual native-born U.S. citizens. It was a nightmare.
Perpetual servitude. That's chilling.
It really was. And the system was inherently corruptible. We know the British Consul General in New York, a guy named Thomas Barclay, even acknowledged how often errors were made. He spent a lot of time intervening, trying to prove that men seized were, in fact, Native Americans.
So it violated fundamental American liberty and security.
Absolutely. And our sources are crystal clear on this. The only effective remedy, the only real solution, was for the British to abandon the practice altogether.
Which they wouldn't do.
But
here's a tricky part. If the U.S. felt this was such an intolerable violation of sovereignty, why was American opinion inside the U.S. so divided on it? The critique highlights that some really key American thinkers actually sided with the British claim, at least in principle.
Yeah, this is a nuance that's absolutely crucial to understanding the political paralysis that led up to 1812. Many American intellectuals, even revolutionary statesmen, they understood the tremendous pressure, the, quote, constraint under which the British government and people both lay.
What constraint?
Well, remember the context. Britain is fighting Napoleon for its very existence. They genuinely believed that losing, say, 10,000 skilled sailors to the American merchant marine could literally mean the difference between national survival and defeat.
So it was an existential issue for them, too.
They certainly saw it that way.
Right.
And who exemplified this understanding better than Gouverneur Morris?
Right. Tell us about him. A big name.
Huge. Brilliant guy. Helped draft the Constitution, trusted confidant of George Washington. And he was one of the clearest voices against going to war over impressment.
What was his reasoning?
In 1808, he argued forcefully that the British claim to seize their own native seamen was, his word, valid and basically unavoidable given their life-or-death struggle with Napoleon. He saw the U.S. position as dangerously illogical.
Yeah, so?
He called fighting a ruinous war just to protect foreign sailors, remember. Many impressed sailors were British deserters. He called that downright madness.
Wow, madness.
Yeah, he felt the U.S. was demanding Britain essentially surrender its means of defense in the middle of a world war. He thought that was asking the impossible, and the cost of forcing the issue was way too high.
So the diplomatic problem wasn't just simple right versus wrong. It was whose right was more critical in that specific high-stakes moment. Britain needed sailors for survival. The U.S. needed its sovereignty respected.
Absolutely. And the U.S. administration, Jefferson, and then Madison, while genuinely outraged morally, they consistently seemed to minimize the sheer political reality of fighting a global superpower over this.
They thought principles alone would win.
It seems that way. They believed demanding Britain surrender the impressment claim was enforcing a principle. But London saw it as threatening the survival of the Royal Navy. So when diplomacy failed, things got much, much hotter with the Chesapeake incident in 1807.
Yes, the Chesapeake. That really was the tipping point, wasn't it? Attacking a commissioned U.S. warship felt fundamentally different from grabbing sailors off merchant ships.
Oh, it was an act of war, plain and simple. HMS Leopard fires on the USS Chesapeake, boards it, seizes 4 men, killing several Americans in the process. This was condemned across the U.S. as an act of hostility. It only differed in circumstance, not principle, from an outright invasion.
So Madison's administration tried to use this huge public outrage, right, to force Britain's hand on the whole impressment issue.
Immediately. They tried to leverage the Chesapeake incident to demand Britain give up the claim entirely for merchant vessels and warships. But Britain refused.
Why? They apologized for the Chesapeake attack itself, didn't they?
They did, quickly. They viewed attacking the nationalist ship as hostility, a mistake. But they absolutely maintained the underlying right to recover deserters from merchant vessels. That distinction was critical for them.
So the incident just hardened the positions.
Totally. It just emphasized that the two nations were operating on fundamentally opposed principles that negotiation couldn't bridge. It accelerated the path to war, and it forced the U.S. administration to look for another weapon.
Which was?
Commerce. Economic warfare.
Yeah, right. So with diplomacy failing on impressment, the whole fight shifts to the global commercial battlefield. You've got Napoleon's continental system trying to lock Britain out of Europe.
Economic strangulation attempt number 1.
And then Britain hits back with the Orders in Council, their counter-blockade, and the United States is just caught right in the middle.
Completely trapped between titans. Napoleon says, no trade with Britain or anyone who trades with Britain. Britain says, fine. Any ship trading with Napoleonic Europe has to stop in Britain first, pay taxes, get searched. An impossible spot for the U.S., the world's biggest neutral carrier at the time.
It feels almost like that ancient Greek law the sources mention, Solon's law.
Yeah, it's a fascinating parallel. Solon's law basically said that in a civil war, if you didn't pick a side, you lost your rights.
Take a side or suffer.
Pretty much. The U.S., being neither French nor British, was effectively told, choose or face the consequences from both blockades. And this is where Jefferson and Madison made their monumental miscalculation.
Thinking they could avoid war by just using economic muscle.
Exactly. They gambled that Britain, even though it saw impressment and sea control as essential to national honor and national safety, could be forced to yield simply by the threat of commercial embarrassment.
That seems naive. Underestimating British resolve.
Hugely. It was an estimate based on what the source material pretty bluntly calls a sordid view of national feeling. They assumed the British merchant class would just freak out and pressure the government to cave before the nation sacrificed its core naval principles.
And the main tool for this coercion was the Embargo Act of 1807.
That was the big one. December 1807. Madison tried to spin it as a measure of precaution only, just protecting American ships and sailors from being seized by either Britain or France.
But come on, in reality, the embargo was aimed squarely at Britain, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was entirely hostile. By inflicting this extreme economic wound, cutting off vital American raw materials like cotton and tobacco, crucial for British industry, plus supplies needed for their war against Napoleon and Spain.
The Peninsula War.
Right. By doing that, the embargo was, in effect, cooperating with Napoleon's continental system. It was designed to starve Britain into submission.
And how did that work out?
It failed spectacularly. Just a disaster on every single level.
How so?
Well, the Embargo Act, quote, entailed most of the miseries of war without any of its compensations.
Meaning?
It collapsed the American economy, especially in New England shipping centers. But it completely failed to generate any kind of unifying popular enthusiasm for the government's strategy. Instead, it was just hated and despised.
People weren't willing to sacrifice that much.
Not for this. It bred what the records call illusion, sneaking, and demoralizing behavior. Citizens actively worked around the law, smuggling goods out, totally circumventing the government's authority.
So the government basically lost all credibility because it asked people to destroy their livelihoods.
Right.
While simultaneously refusing to build up the military needed to protect them if this whole economic gamble failed.
That's the tragic irony right there.
Yeah.
And the widespread evasion of the embargo, it directly foreshadowed the outright aid given to the British enemy later during the actual war. They completely alienated the commercial classes.
Okay, so economic coercion blows up in their face. The Madison administration then tries to pivot back to diplomacy, right? But that led to more screw-ups.
Yeah, a series of just embarrassing blunders.
Let's walk through them. First, the Erskine incident. What happened there?
Okay, 1809. This really showed the huge gap in understanding between London and Washington. David Erskine, he was the British minister in D.C. He seemed to genuinely believe he could fix things.
How?
He basically promised Madison that Britain would revoke the orders in council if the U.S. made certain concessions. Madison jumped at it, thinking, great, the British are finally giving in. But Erskine had acted way, way beyond his official instructions from London. George Canning, the British Foreign Secretary back home, publicly and immediately just disavowed the whole agreement.
Ouch. So Madison looked completely foolish.
Totally naive, duped. And then, to make it worse, Canning replaced Erskine with a guy named Francis Jackson.
And Jackson wasn't exactly Mr. Diplomacy, was he?
Not even close. Jackson arrived seemingly determined to just rub salt in the wound. His mandate was seen as severe, insulting even.
What did he do?
He basically asserted in official letters that the U.S. administration knew Erskine didn't have the authority to make that deal, implying they acted in bad faith when they ratified it.
Whoa. Accusing the president of lying.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That was too much even for Madison. He delivered this rare, really severe public rebuke and just suspended all communication with Jackson. Kicked him out, effectively.
And Canning, back in London.
Our sources paint Canning as this master of political insolence, able to go right up to the ultimate verge of insult without technically crossing the line of diplomatic no-nos. But the whole episode just highlighted how vulnerable the U.S. administration was diplomatically.
But the biggest humiliation, the sources argue, wasn't even from the British. It was caused by French finesse. Basically, Napoleon being sneaky about some decree in 1811.
Oh yeah, this is a perfect example of Madison just being completely outmaneuvered, utterly outwitted.
What was the setup?
Okay, the U.S. government, desperate for leverage against Britain, passed this law called Macon's Bill No. 2. It basically said, if either Britain or France stops their trade restrictions against us, we'll flap non-intercourse measures on the other country.
An attempt to play them off each other.
Right. Napoleon saw his chance. He sent word through his minister, the Duc de Cador, saying, okay, our decrees restricting trade, they're repealed. But
there's always a but with Napoleon.
Always. There were secret, crucial conditions and catches that were completely hidden from the U.S.
And the American envoy over there, Joel Barlow, he bought it.
He was actively misled. The U.S. government became convinced the French decrees were really repealed. So based on that, they went ahead and imposed the trade restrictions against Britain alone, effectively attaching the U.S. to Napoleon's continental system.
But Napoleon hadn't actually repealed them?
Nope. What Madison didn't know was that Napoleon hadn't formally done anything. The French only produced this spurious decree dated April 28, 1811, but almost certainly cooked up much later. And they only showed it quietly to the U.S. envoy, Russell, after the U.S. had already taken action against Britain.
That's just straight-up deception.
Strategic deception at its finest. The French deliberately avoided giving clear proof because their main goal wasn't fairness. It was, quote, to entangle us in a war with England.
Sir Madison's administration committed the country to siding against Britain based not on principle, but on being, as the source says, outwitted in a paltry bargain. They were completely cornered by 1812.
Totally cornered. They had exhausted every non-military option. All they'd achieved was economic collapse at home and diplomatic humiliation abroad. The path to war was now pretty much set. But even that was messed up.
How so?
Madison, finally realizing war was inevitable, sends his war message on June 1st, 1812. Congress declares war June 18th. But they tried one last preparatory measure before that.
The 90-day embargo in April 1812.
Exactly. A critical step, theoretically. It was meant to keep American ships and, crucially, experienced seamen at home, ready for the war effort.
Makes sense.
But the measure was largely defeated before it even started. Key opposition politicians, figures like Quincy, Lloyd, Emilad Red, they immediately tipped off the commercial centers, especially in New England, that war was coming.
Wait, they warned people so they could get around the embargo. That sounds close to treason.
It was certainly devastating to national preparedness. Niles Register, a major publication then, reported this absolute frenzy that followed. Dray teams working night and day, loading ships, a frantic hurly-burly to palsy the arm of the government.
How much got out?
An estimated $15 million worth of provisions, flour, grain, vital supplies, rushed out of the country in just 5 days. It showed this deep public demoralization and a complete lack of faith in what the government was doing.
And then the ultimate historical irony kicks in. War declared June 18th.
And the British orders in council, the main casus belli, the reason they were supposedly fighting, revoked just 5 days later, June 23rd.
Too late.
5 days too late to stop the declaration. It proved the commercial coercion had finally worked. in a way.
But only when war was literally imminent.
Right. But the news didn't reach the U.S. in time. So the nation stumbled into war, a discordant, almost a disunited nation, and fought wholly unprepared. Army, Navy, Treasury, all in terrible shape.
Okay, so the country goes into war unprepared, divided. Let's turn to the military conflict itself. And the land war, well, it didn't just start poorly. It started in a state of outright military disgrace.
Disgrace is the right word. It was the absolutely inevitable result of more than a decade of Jefferson's anti-military policies. The Army was led by, quote, elderly men, many of whom had long since, quote, disacquired any real military knowledge they might have picked up during the Revolution.
Disacquired. Like they forgot.
That's the implication. The military analyst's assessment in our source is just damning. As far as American movements are concerned, the campaign of 1812 is almost beneath criticism. It was incompetence on a scale that genuinely shocked foreign observers.
And the strategic planning, or lack thereof, just made it worse. Where should the U.S. military have focused its efforts in Canada?
Okay, the primary strategic objective, agreed upon by basically all sound military thinkers then and now, should have been taking either Montreal or Kingston.
Why those two?
Capturing either one would have severed Canada's crucial internal communication lines. It would have cut the Western Territories off from the sea, off from British supplies coming up to the St. Lawrence. The U.S. actually had huge natural advantages here, easy routes up the Hudson River and via Lake Champlain. Even Brock, the best British general they had, knew that cutting the link between Montreal and Kingston would decide Canada's fate.
Makes perfect sense. Cut the supply line. So where did the U.S. forces focus instead?
Instead of concentrating on that vital eastern corridor, they focused way out west, on the Detroit frontier.
That seems backwards.
A critical, fundamental strategic blunder. And it led directly to General William Hull's disaster in August 1812.
Okay, walk us through Hull's disaster.
Hull crosses into Canada near Detroit. He has maybe 1,400 to 1,600 men. He actually has the advantage initially. He's facing weak, demoralized British regulars and militia at Fort Malden. Hull himself later admitted he could have easily taken Malden by storm right at the start.
So why didn't he? What went wrong?
Paralysis. Simple command paralysis. Hull just delayed. He hesitated. He kept waiting for orders that weren't coming or for better conditions or something.
And that delay was fatal.
Absolutely. It gave British reinforcements time to arrive. It let the local Canadian militia recover their morale. And crucially, it allowed the Native American tribes under the formidable Tecumseh to see which way the wind was blowing and rally to the British side.
Oh, man, and it got worse.
Even worse. Some of Hull's letters were captured, and they revealed to the British general, Brock, Hull's deep apprehensions and the fearful, shaky moral condition of his command.
You just cannot let the enemy know you're scared.
Never. It basically guarantees defeat. So when Brock finally counterattacked, Hull was driven back across the border. And then, despite having supplies and arguably a fighting chance, he just surrendered the entire fort of Detroit after a really brief, hesitant defense. The whole northwestern campaign lost in weeks. Not because of British strength, but because of catastrophic American leadership.
Ugh, okay, a total mess on land. But the narrative shifts pretty dramatically when we look out at sea where the tiny U.S. Navy was operating. Our sources point to a really crucial military lesson learned almost immediately by those few American frigates.
Yes, and it's a lesson about disproportionate influence. It shows how a comparatively small, active, well-focused force, just a handful of frigates and sloops, can exert an influence utterly out of proportion to its actual numbers, especially when you target the enemy's communications.
This was the strategy Gouverneur Morris had argued for earlier, right?
Exactly. The strategy he said they should have focused on instead of a land invasion. And it was proved absolutely right in the opening months of the war.
So how did this tiny U.S. Navy achieve such big results?
2 words: concentration of force. The U.S. frigates, like the famous Constitution, the President, the United States, they put to sea together, often cruising in pairs or small squadrons.
Okay.
Now, the British, remember, were mainly focused on Napoleon. They only had relatively small, scattered squadrons based in Halifax and Bermuda to cover the entire North American coast.
Ah, so if one of those scattered British ships ran into 2 American frigates.
Exactly. They risked being captured or destroyed singly. So this American concentration forced the British to concentrate their own limited forces just to protect themselves.
Which meant
vast stretches of the Atlantic, including the approaches to U.S. ports, were left effectively unpatrolled by the British.
And that, ironically, actually helped American merchant ships.
Precisely. The British had to bunch up, so they weren't blockading U.S. ports very effectively at first. This allowed many American merchant ships that were out at sea when the war started to sail home safely with, quote, comparative impunity. The mere strategic presence of a concentrated U.S. squadron, even a tiny one, tied up and fettered British movements all along the U.S. coast.
Okay, so concentration worked strategically. But the American public, after the disasters on land, desperately needed heroes, and they found them in those famous single-ship duels. The victory of the Constitution over HMS Java in December 1812 is a classic example. Can we dive into the technical reasons for these American successes? What made ships like Constitution so tough?
Right. The Constitution's run of victories against Guerriere, then Java. It was a combination of things. Superb American seamanship, definitely. Excellent gunnery for sure, but also a crucial design advantage.
What was the advantage?
The American heavy frigates, like Constitution, were officially rated as 44-gun ships, but they were actually carrying long, heavy 24-pounder cannons on their main gun deck.
24-pounders. And the standard British frigates.
They were typically rated as 38s, and they carried lighter 18-pounder long guns.
Okay, 24-pound shot versus 18-pound shot. That sounds like a big difference, especially at longer ranges.
Massive difference. It gave the Americans a devastating advantage in hitting power and effective range.
So, in the Constitution versus Java fight, how did that play out?
Well, the British captain, Carden of the Java, arguably made a tactical error. The Americans had the advantage at long range with those 24-pounders. Carden also had short-range carronades, powerful, but only up close. Instead of trying to close the disses quickly to use his carronades,
What did he do?
he chose to prolong the fight at a distance, trying to engage in this complex fencing match, maneuvering for position.
Bad move against heavier guns.
Terrible move.
Okay.
Because that distance, the Constitution's superior long-range 24-pounders just systematically battered the Java.
So the court-martial later criticized Carden for that.
Severely censured him. They basically said, given the American firepower advantage at range, the smaller risk would have been to charge in, close the distance fast, even if it meant taking some hits while closing, being raked, just to get into effective carronade range.
But he didn't.
He didn't. And the Constitution, with its excellent gunnery crews, just dismantled the Java, took down her masts, her bowsprit, reduced her to a floating wreck. It was a powerful demonstration of American naval architecture, training, and gunnery.
Okay. Incredible success in those duels. Now let's swing back inland again, specifically to the fight for the Great Lakes. This was absolutely critical for the northern border. And here, the sources show this dramatic contrast in leadership styles. Oliver Hazard Perry on Lake Erie versus Isaac Chauncey on Lake Ontario.
Yes, a stark contrast.
Yeah.
Perry's success on Lake Erie was almost immediate and totally decisive. Oliver Hazard Perry just displayed this incredible ready initiative and a complete acceptance of necessary risk.
Like when his flagship got destroyed.
Exactly. His flagship, the Lawrence, was battered into basically a wreck, disabled, forced to surrender. But did Perry give up? No. He famously gets rowed across open water, under heavy enemy fire, standing up in the boat apparently, to shift his command flag to the Niagara. That single, incredibly audacious move, leading the final push that broke the British line, secured complete control of Lake Erie. And that, in turn, enabled General Harrison's army to advance successfully on land afterwards.
Just sheer willpower and guts. Now, contrast that with Chauncey on Lake Ontario. He had better resources, right?
Yeah.
More men, more materials.
Way better resources. He had access to more skilled shipwrights, better supply lines, better transport capacity down the Mohawk Valley. But his entire campaign was crippled by excessive caution.
How so? What did Chauncey do or not do?
Chauncey's campaign just dragged through 2 seasons, 1813 and 1814, without any decisive action at all. He was utterly paralyzed by caution. He repeatedly refused to engage the British squadron under Sir James Yeo, even when he clearly had superior numbers and firepower.
Why was he so cautious?
It seems rooted in this very rigid, narrow view of his job. He got into disputes with the Army commander, General Brown. Brown kept asking for joint operations, for the Navy to support land attacks, to control the leak strategically.
Which makes sense. Combined operations.
Absolutely. But Chauncey refused. He flat out declared that the Navy's only mission was to seek out and fight the enemy fleet in a decisive battle. He said the Navy was not supposed to be an appendage of the Army.
That seems like a fundamental misunderstanding of how naval power supports land campaigns.
Yeah.
Cutting supply lines, providing transport, artillery support.
Precisely. His rigid focus on waiting for the perfect fleet-on-fleet showdown meant he completely failed to use the most vital function of naval power in that theater, controlling the lake to cut the enemy's communications between Montreal and Kingston.
So he just let the British move troops and supplies freely.
Pretty much. While he sat cautiously in Sackett's Harbor, the British could reinforce their positions in the West. General Brown, the U.S. Army commander, was left dangerously exposed on the Niagara frontier as a result. He was forced into bloody battles like Lundy's Lane, partly because Chauncey's fleet wasn't applying any pressure on the British supply lines.
So even though Chauncey had the means to potentially cripple the entire British war effort in Upper Canada,
His inaction played right into the British strategy, which was basically delay. The British commander, Drummond, was constantly writing about how worried he was about what Chauncey might do. But Chauncey, by staying put, just gave the British commander Yeo time. Time to build a huge new warship, the St. Lawrence, hoping to gain undisputed naval superiority later. Chauncey's failure to cooperate just left the whole U.S. military effort in the North disorganized and stalled.
Okay, so as the war drags on, and especially after Napoleon is defeated in Europe in 1814, Britain can finally focus its overwhelming naval strength on the United States. And this leads to what our sources call the inexorable blockade.
Yeah, inexorable is a good word. The blockade was systematic, methodical. It really demonstrated Britain's complete mastery of sea control when they put their mind to it. It rolled out in distinct phases.
What were the phases?
Initially, back in 1812, it was more of a loose blockade.
Yeah.
Mainly just targeting U.S. warships, trying to respect neutral shipping rights still. But by early 1813, it hardened into a proper commercial blockade.
Targeting trade directly.
Right. Imposed first on major economic hubs like Delaware and Chesapeake Bays, then gradually extended up the coast to New York and down south. This required a much larger, more permanent British naval force stationed offshore to enforce it against all ships, neutral or American.
And then, in 1814, they really tightened the screws, the total blockade.
That was the final stage. Admiral Cochrane declared it in May 1814, and the language was deliberately sweeping. It covered, quote, all the ports, harbors, bays, creeks, rivers, inlets, outlets, islands, and seacoasts, from New Brunswick all the way down to Florida.
Basically the entire U.S. coastline.
Everything. And this declaration was specifically designed to defy the American argument that a legal blockade had to be specific to a port and closely watched by an adequate force right there. Britain was essentially saying, we have the power, we declare the whole coast blockaded, deal with it. It signaled they were using their full global might to just choke the U.S. economy to death.
And the economic toll must have been just devastating. What do the numbers show? How bad did it get for American commerce?
The economic strangulation was, universal, inexorable, irresistible. Just look at the export numbers. The total value of U.S. exports in 1807, that was the last full year of unrestricted trade before the embargo hit, was a pretty healthy $108 million.
Okay. And by 1814?
By 1814, it plummeted to just $7 million.
Wow. From $108 million to $7 million. That's annihilation.
Practical annihilation. The blockade didn't just stop exports, it severed internal communication by sea. The produce of the South and the Middle States, tobacco, cotton, grain, couldn't get out. It just piled up, worthless. Those regions were drained of hard currency of specie.
And this national economic misery was made even worse by serious internal conflict, right? Specifically, this blatant collusion with the enemy happening in New England.
Yeah, this is a really dark chapter in the war's story. The blockade didn't hit all regions the same way. New England shipping, while damaged, survived partially, and sometimes quite profitably, through what the sources bluntly call a collusive intercourse with the British, using special British licenses.
Licenses? The British gave Americans permission to trade.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Britain desperately needed supplies, especially grain and flour, for two places. Their huge armies fighting Napoleon down in Spain and Portugal.
Wellington's army.
Right. And also for their own forces fighting up in Canada. So the British government issued specific licenses, actual official documents to American vessels.
Mm-hmm.
These licenses granted them protection from seizure by the Royal Navy if they were carrying these vital provisions to specific destinations, usually British-controlled or Allied ports like Lisbon.
That's incredible. So while the rest of the U.S. is being strangled,
some New England merchants are making money by feeding the enemy's armies. It created this outrageous disparity. British supply officers, their commissaries, openly confirmed that the British forces in Canada, quote, could not keep the field but for supplies sent from the United States.
That's treasonous, isn't it? Or close to it?
It was seen by many as a grievous military evil. It directly undermined the national war effort and massively fueled the already bitter sectional tensions between New England and the rest of the country.
Okay, so with the U.S. Navy bottled up by the blockade, unable to fight fleet actions, the only way America could really hit back was through commerce destruction. This is where the famous American privateers come in.
Exactly. Commerce destruction became the only viable offensive measure left. It was the American reply to the grinding pressure of the blockade. Now, we have to differentiate the two main efforts here.
Okay.
You had the national cruisers, the Navy frigates and sloops that managed to slip the blockade. Their main job, strategically, was to hunt down British warships, protect American shipping lanes if possible, and disrupt enemy strategy.
And the privateers?
The privateers were different. These were privately owned ships, armed and commissioned by the government, but funded entirely by merchant investors. Their goal wasn't strategy, it was raw profit. Capture enemy merchant ships, sell the ships and cargo, make money for the investors and crew.
But both efforts, Navy and privateers, were pretty destructive to British trade.
Oh, highly destructive. They caused genuine humiliation and alarm in Britain, especially considering the small number of American ships involved.
How? Where were they operating?
The audacity was key. American commerce raiders, both Navy ships like the Argus and privateers like the Chasseur or True-Blooded Yankee, didn't just stick to American waters. They actively sailed across the Atlantic and targeted the approaches to the British Isles themselves, the English Channel, the Irish Sea.
Right, in Britain's backyard.
Exactly. This proved Commodore Rodgers' prediction from before the war was right from Dama. He'd argued the coasts of England weren't nearly as well defended as everyone assumed. The resulting chaos caused a genuine insurance crisis in London.
An insurance crisis because of a few American ships.
It sounds surprising, but yes. In August 1814, the cost of marine insurance for voyages just between England and Ireland, a short, supposedly safe trip, soared. Premiums went from less than £1 per cent up to 5 guineas per cent.
That's a massive jump, like 500% or more.
Huge increase. It shows how high the perceived risk had become. It meant American raiders were hitting targets frequently and successfully, right in waters the British thought were secure.
What was the reaction from British merchants?
Panic and outrage. Merchants in big ports like Liverpool and Glasgow sent these desperate petitions, called memorials, to the Admiralty. They lamented that, quote, a horde of American cruisers should be allowed, unheeded, unmolested, unresisted, to take, burn, or sink our own vessels in our own inlets. They were furious.
Let's look closer at the privateers themselves. Can you give us that anecdote about the privateer Kemp? It really shows their daring.
Oh, the Kemp of Baltimore is a fantastic example. Pure privateering audacity, combined with great seamanship. Okay, so the Kemp is cruising off the coast of North Carolina. She spots a convoy of 7 British merchant ships, escorted by a Royal Navy frigate.
Okay, heavily outnumbered and outgunned by the escort.
Right. The frigate chases the Kemp off initially, standard procedure. But the captain of the Kemp doesn't give up. He uses his ship's speed to outrun the frigate, loses her in the dark, and then circles back and tracks down the convoy again the next morning.
That takes guts, going back after the merchants without the escort.
Exactly. When the Kemp reappears, the 7 merchant ships try to form a line of battle to defend themselves. But the Kemp, and get this, she only had a small crew. About 53 men, she just sails right in and engages all 7 of them.
1 against 7.
1 against 7. And she systematically boarded or forced the surrender of 6 out of the 7 British merchantmen in that single fight.
Incredible. That must have been a huge payday.
Enormous profit for the investors back in Baltimore. And it just shows the capability of these fast, aggressive, well-handled privateering vessels.
So how did the privateers stack up overall compared to the National Navy cruisers in terms of success?
It's interesting. Our sources indicate over 500 privateers were commissioned during the war. But maybe 3 out of 5 of them ultimately returned empty-handed. Either they were captured themselves or just didn't find any prizes. It was a risky business.
But the ones that were successful?
The 207 or so successful privateers averaged about 6.5 prizes each, which is pretty good.
And the Navy cruisers?
The national cruisers, the Navy ships, actually did slightly better on average, despite having a harder time escaping the blockade since the British were specifically hunting them. They averaged about 9 prizes each. This suggests the highly trained crews and potentially better discipline of the U.S. Navy ships often led to more consistent success, especially on those long, dangerous cruises far from American shores, like in the waters around Britain or even the Indian Ocean.
All right, so by 1814, with Napoleon dealt with, Britain's focus shifts. It's less about the original causes of the war now and more about, well, punishment and maybe grabbing some territory. They decided the terror and the suffering needed to be brought home to American citizens.
Yeah, partly as retaliation for some American actions in Canada, like the burning of York, modern Toronto.
Yeah.
This punitive shift led directly to the British campaign in the Chesapeake Bay region in the summer of 1814.
The goal wasn't conquest there, was it?
Not really sustainable conquest. It was more about raiding, disrupting, and making a very painful point. The British landed a veteran force, less than 5,000 men, but battle-hardened from the Napoleonic Wars, and they marched directly on Washington, D.C.
Which led to the ultimate symbolic humiliation for the U.S.
The burning of Washington. They found, as the sources say, neither defenses nor defenders of any real consequence, despite the capital being in a populated area with natural defensive advantages.
The sight of the White House and the Capitol burning, it must have been just devastating for American morale.
Profound shock. And the sources really placed the blame squarely on the administration, on Jefferson and Madison, for 12 years of neglecting military preparedness. The local American commander, General Winder, apparently showed personal bravery, but he was doomed by the situation he inherited. His militia forces were hastily assembled, poorly trained, and literally arrived at the battlefield of Bladensburg just minutes before the fighting started.
Unbelievable.
The complete failure of preparedness allowed this relatively small British force to walk into the nation's capital.
Meanwhile, further north, the British were focused on grabbing territory, weren't they, in Maine?
Yes, the occupation of eastern Maine was different. They seized Castine and the whole Penobscot River region. This wasn't just punitive, it was a pragmatic military move.
What was the goal?
Their aim was to secure an overland all-weather communication route between Quebec City and the naval base at Halifax, Nova Scotia. They needed a chunk of Maine to do that reliably.
And they treated the locals differently there.
Yeah, interestingly, they promised protection and decent administration to the inhabitants in occupied Maine, a sharp contrast to the burning and raiding down in Chesapeake. During this operation, the American frigate USS Adams, which had taken refuge up the Penobscot River, had to be burned by its own crew to prevent the British from capturing her.
So the British now held American territory, which they planned to use as a bargaining chip.
Exactly. That successful occupation of Maine became a key piece of leverage the British ministry intended to use to demand territorial concessions in the peace negotiations that were starting up in Ghent, Belgium.
Okay, so things look incredibly bleak for the U.S. in late summer 1814. Washington burned, Maine occupied, the economy shattered, the blockade strangling everything. And yet the tide turned dramatically because of one singular, strategically vital naval battle.
Lake Champlain. Macdonough's victory in September 1814. It was, without exaggeration, the diplomatic turning point of the entire war.
Tell us about it. What made Macdonough's victory so crucial?
Captain Thomas Macdonough. He was commanding the small American squadron on Lake Champlain. He knew a major British invasion was coming down from Canada, led by Sir George Prevost, the Governor-General. Prevost had a large army, maybe 10,000 veteran troops, many fresh from Wellington's campaigns.
A serious threat.
Huge. But Prevost needed control of the lake to supply his army as it advanced south. Macdonough anticipated the British attack and very cleverly positioned his ships in Plattsburgh Bay.
How did he position them?
He knew the prevailing winds and the shape of the bay. He anchored his ships stem to stern in a line, but crucially he rigged them with springs on their anchor cables. This allowed him, even while anchored, to pivot his ships around.
Why was that important?
Because in the heat of the battle, when one side of his flagship, the Saratoga, was heavily damaged and its guns mostly disabled, Macdonough was able to use those springs to literally wind his ship around 180 degrees, bringing his fresh, undamaged portside battery to bear on the British flagship.
Tactical genius under fire.
Absolutely brilliant seamanship and foresight. That maneuver basically won the battle. The British naval force in the lake was completely defeated, captured, or destroyed.
And the impact on Prevost's invasion army?
Immediate and total. Without control of the lake, Prevost couldn't guarantee his supply lines. Despite having a vastly superior land force that hadn't even been seriously engaged yet, he felt compelled to order an immediate retreat back into Canada. Macdonough's victory completely stopped the invasion in its tracks and made any further serious British conquest in the American interior impossible.
And the significance of this victory wasn't lost on the top military mind of the age, right? The Duke of Wellington.
No, Wellington's assessment was absolutely critical. After Napoleon's first defeat, the British government apparently considered sending Wellington himself over to command in America and finish the war.
Wow. Wellington in America.
Imagine. But they asked for his counsel first, and his reply was blunt, honest, and completely devastating to the British government's negotiating position at Ghent.
What did he say?
He stated flatly that Britain could achieve no further military success in America unless it first gained absolute naval superiority on the Great Lakes. He basically said, unless you can guarantee me control of the lakes, there's no point in me going. He even added he would only go to America if he could ensure that superiority. Otherwise, he'd just be going, quote, to sign a peace which might as well be signed now.
That's a direct shot at the Admiralty's failure on the lakes.
Completely. He implicitly endorsed Prevost's decision to retreat after Macdonough's victory. And his conclusion was stark. Britain, lacking that naval control, had no military basis and therefore no right to demand any territorial concessions from the United States. He contemptuously brushed aside the occupation of Maine as irrelevant leverage.
So Wellington's advice just pulled the rug out from under the British negotiators at Ghent.
Entirely. They had been pushing hard for major concessions, taking that chunk of Maine, creating a huge independent Indian buffer state in the Northwest, which would have been carved out of U.S. territory, demilitarizing the Great Lakes for the U.S., but not for Britain.
Big demands. How did the American commissioners react, especially once Wellington's view became known?
The American team, John Quincy Adams, Albert Gallatin, Henry Clay, they stood incredibly firm throughout. Even before Wellington's advice filtered through, they recognized those British demands for what they were. Military questions, not diplomatic ones. They basically told the British that those demands were only fit subjects for discussion, quote, when it becomes necessary to decide upon the expediency of an absolute surrender of national independence.
Strong words, basically saying, we'll fight to the end before agreeing to that.
They called the British bluff. And the British, faced with Wellington's pragmatic military assessment, Macdonough's victory making conquest impossible, and the increasingly unstable situation back in Europe, Napoleon was about to escape from Elba, they blinked.
So what was the final outcome? The Treaty of Ghent, signed December 1814.
The British abandoned all their territorial demands. The war ended based on status quo antebellum.
Okay, let's unpack that Latin phrase for our listeners.
Yeah.
Status quo antebellum, what does that mean here?
It literally means the state of things before the war. So essentially, both sides just agreed to stop fighting and go back to the way things were before the conflict started in 1812. All captured territory was returned. The British gave back Maine. The U.S. gave back captured parts of Canada.
And what about the original causes, impressment, the orders in council?
Not mentioned. The treaty was completely silent on the issues that had actually started the war. It was simply an agreement to end the fighting and restore the pre-war borders.
So, in a way, nothing was formally resolved.
Formally, no. But the context had changed. Britain, post-Napoleon, gradually stopped impressment anyway, and the orders in council were long gone. But the treaty itself proved a crucial point made by the sources. Timely, strategic preparedness before the war, the kind the U.S. disastrously lacked, could likely have achieved far more, perhaps even forced Britain to renounce impressment formally, than what was ultimately salvaged through sheer diplomatic firmness, backed only by a couple of late, narrow military victories like Macdonough's. #outro.
So this deep dive into the War of 1812 really gives us some incredibly detailed and frankly challenging lessons. We've seen the profound, almost religious power of that British sea tradition driving their policy way beyond just profit.
Absolutely central.
We detailed the disastrous political miscalculation of trying to use commercial coercion, economic warfare, without having the military muscle to back it up,
Right.
which just exposed the nation to contempt and defeat early on.
A painful lesson in strategy.
And then we recognized the truly disproportionate war-saving impact that a tiny but focused and well-led U.S. Navy could have, particularly with commanders like Perry and Macdonough when employed aggressively and skillfully.
Yeah, the central tragedy, though, as the records really confirm, is that the war left this lingering, almost perceptive impression of success in the American memory.
Because of those few naval victories.
Exactly. Thanks mostly to those brilliant single-ship actions early on, and then Macdonough's heroism at the very end. But the true record for most of the war was one of, quote, gloom, disaster, and governmental incompetence.
Stemming from
that stubborn, almost ideological bias against proper military readiness that dominated the Jefferson and Madison administrations. The potential was there. The U.S. absolutely possessed the resources, the wealth, the population to place its Navy on such a footing before the war ever started.
what?
That for Great Britain to persist in the practice of impressment would have been, quote, impolitic to the verge of madness? It could have deterred it.
So the nation ultimately secured its sovereignty, yes, but at an immense and arguably unnecessary cost in blood, treasure, and national humiliation. And that really brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The only truly effective remedy to the outrage of impressment was the complete abandonment of the practice by Great Britain, which eventually happened, but not because of the treaty. Since the U.S. did not create a navy capable of compelling this change before the war began, what is the ultimate cost, do you think, to a free nation when it relies primarily on legal arguments and economic threats, rather than ensuring it has adequate, strategic, timely military preparedness to defend its interests?
What does that cost mean today? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
We'll see you next time.